Kim Hiller is an independent media and social and political analyst. She's also the author of No White Lies, Black Politics and White Power in South Africa, which was published in December 2020 and was on Exclusive Books bestseller list for local nonfiction. Her writing on the lack of social and economic transformation and justice in South Africa have been published both locally and internationally. Her outspoken views on white supremacy, privilege, and power have been televised in South Africa and beyond. Kim has worked on national and provincial political campaigns, conducted political polling, post-campaign analysis for the ANC, independent newspapers, and the EFF. She was a member of the ANC for many years and left the ANC to join the EFF in 2014. She was the first democratically elected deputy secretary of the EFF in Gauteng. She's no longer affiliated with any political parties and is currently working on 2 other non-fictional books. Welcome, everyone, and we've been eagerly anticipating this talk. And thank you so much, Kim, for being here, and I'll hand over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. I'm assuming.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for this platform. And I'm quite technologically behind par. So I'm glad that I actually managed to do this. Thank you so much for hosting me on this space. It's really a privilege, and I see some of the speakers that you've had, and I always feel intimidated speaking to such brilliant academics. So what I'd like to do is I'd love to just make this into a more informal discussion. I always enjoy the questions from people. And just to say that I have this forum is also being held live, taken live at on a forum that's hosted by Dr. Deza. He's an apostle, and he's also very involved in educating young people, a teacher. And he runs a group called the EFF 101. Although it's an EFF-orientated group, it's a forum for young minds and young people and young discussions. So I see he's got a lot of people listening. So I think we've gone to a bigger forum than is even here. But I'm very grateful, as I said, to be part of this. And I think I'm really going to speak about the never-ending story of white supremacy in South Africa. And I always introduce myself as a white settler, as the true foreigner in South Africa. And people sometimes get quite concerned when I describe myself as that, because we're all into this myth of being a happy nation where the races run through fields in unison and share bright and beautiful futures together, excel together at universities on an equal footing. But that is sadly not the case. So what I've done is I've really tried to be very honest about the state of racism in the country, about the lack of transformation, and about the culpability, really, of white people in not doing enough to shift the dynamics of the society. So when I speak about myself as a settler, as a foreigner on land that was stolen by my forefathers, it's quite an important statement, because what I'm saying there is that I'm recognizing, which a lot of white people don't do, the fact that white people have come into this country and caused mass destruction. Although colonization is seen by some white people like Helen Ziller as an advance, what we saw was that colonization has totally destroyed not only the economics and the economic well-being of Black South Africans, but placed their culture and cultural interactions, their value systems and knowledge systems secondary to the Western Bibles of epistemology. And so I say I introduce myself like that for a number of reasons, because there's also this concept that of white people in the so-called Rainbow Nation wanting to be seen as African. And once again, I've come up against the ideology, if I can call it that, or world perspective of Helen Ziller, who has proudly proclaimed herself as an African. And I've said there's no such thing as a white African. And there may be people on this platform that disagree with me. Certainly, it's a statement that has created quite a lot of tension against me. But I say that because the same white people under apartheid were very happy to sit on a European-only bench. They were very happy to sit in a first-class carriage on a train, while their Black South African, so-called fellow Black South Africans, were forced into tiny compartments as if they were cattle. And white people were very happy at that stage to be seen as Europeans, and now they claim to be Africans. But I think this is part of the whole syndrome of what I call white supremacy, because we have held on as white people to our unearned privilege, to our unearned power, in fact, to our illicit power, because power was gained on the back of a destruction of the indigenous Black nation. And for those who have thought that things have changed in 1994, it's just an illusion. I used to actually describe myself as a Kaiser Chiefs supporter, but about 18 months ago, I stopped that because it's a rather embarrassing title. My Amathole for life status, I think I'm reviewing at the moment, and I say to people, I'm on a sabbatical as far as football is concerned. So what we've seen is that the history that we've had, the vile history of racist oppression and subjugation, has caused economics, cultural, spiritual, epistemological erasure. In fact, some people even speak about colonialism as a terrorism, economic terrorism. And I'm just going to look at what are the remnants of colonialism in current day South Africa. And I'm just beginning. I'm a great fan and I think scholar of Frans Fanon, and you'll see him appearing in this talk. I think I'll speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then really would love to open up to discussions. So one of his quotes, and he writes a lot about the omnipotence and omnipresence of whiteness. And he says, the earth rasps under my feet, and there is a white song, all this whiteness that burns me. And that's what I feel about the current day South Africa, where whiteness is woven or infused into everything, from the economic landscape to the cultural landscape to the planes of the universities. So just looking at a little bit of history, if we look at what the ANC inherited in 1994, they inherited a system of cultural, social, and economic system that was purposely calculated to undermine and dislodge Black people. And under colonialism and apartheid, as anyone on this forum would know, Black people were turned from very successful, actually sustainable farmers in many cases, and certainly sustainable households in the large, to an underclass, a servant underclass for white farmers and agriculturalists, as well as the mining sector. And what we would have thought is that in 1994, the dynamics of this would have changed. But in the words of Dr. Verwoerd, and I might misquote him, I always tend to misquote famous people, he said, we must take the implementation of separate development so far that no future government will ever be able to reverse it. And that's really what's happened, because 30 years into democracy, what should have been an economic and cultural wonderland for Black people is simply a wasteland of opportunities. And I think this discussion is important being held in this year as the ANC goes to elections, or everyone goes to elections, because we need to say as South Africans, are we going to see any differences in the composition of our society, in the structure of our universities, if we continue this way? And what I wanted to speak about is the fact that one of the things that I believe the ANC has done worst is to have crystallized the level of poverty in the society that was the child, really the birth child of white supremacy. Instead of eradicating it, it has simply reproduced the same apartheid-fueled architecture and the power relationships that came out of that. So today we have a desperately unequal society. The problem where I see a lot of trauma is that the Black child of today, the Black student of today, the Black professional, is told that he's working and he's operating on even terrain. And I think that is very unfair. It almost puts a double burden on the Black child, because he is well behind because of generational prejudice. His opportunities are nowhere near that of a white child. And when he sees, or she sees, a mediocre white person being appointed over him or her, they then see that as a failure because they're told everything is even and fair. But that's not the case. The case is that our society is filled with the prejudice of apartheid. We haven't shifted those power relations. And I was saying at a talk I did last week at UNISA with a very esteemed panel, actually, besides myself. As always, I was the white person who didn't have a doctorate, and I was with very powerful and well-recognized Black scholars in this country and beyond. And I was saying to them that the biggest big crisis is that the ANC has left a legacy of crystallizing these inequalities. And I'd love to discuss how this still works in the university environment as well as in society at large, so that we have created an ecosystem that is no different from colonial masters or apartheid masters. And the Black child will never flourish in that until we address the situation that we are a deeply unequal society. I was writing an article on Rwanda the other day, and I said, in 30 years, South Africa has gone from a miracle nation to the most unequal nation in the world. Imagine that we have deteriorated to that extent. What we see in Rwanda, despite some of its difficulties, is that it's gone from a country of total devastation to almost being a miracle nation, where its growth, GDP, and other factors are on the rise, where South Africa isn't. Going back to the construction of the Rainbow Nation, I always think it's a masterful creation, to use a pun, of the apartheid and white contingency across media, all the vested interest groups across business, and perhaps even across academia, to preserve white privilege. And I speak about the Rainbow Nation in my book as the medicine of the white man, which has actually harmed rather than healed the nation. I speak about how the Rainbow Nation has kicked out the very notion, as well as practice, of Black liberation. What we see is Black consciousness has been completely knocked into a side alley as the speak of non-racialism has filled our ears, and we must all stand and applaud that. Those things have absolutely snuffed out any possibility of liberation in this country. So I'm saying, in other words, that white privilege and power is in very good shape in South Africa today. And that is because the actual architecture of apartheid was never changed. So what the ANC did, and I've decided, I used to be a member of the party in 1994. In fact, I was a very junior researcher on Nelson Mandela's team. And at that stage, there seemed to be some commitment to shifting the fortunes and fate of Black South Africans. I sensed a genuine commitment. And what we have 30 years later is what I call the greatest act of social distancing that we've seen in South Africa. And that is between the governing party and the masses of people. And my great discovery in my own head, whether we can challenge that or not, is that sadly the ANC has become the party that is more interested in white interests than in the fate and dignity of a Black child. And they've preserved the interests and infrastructure to allow white privilege to thrive. So I think Verwoerd must be smiling in his grave right now to see that he was correct, that very little has shifted in the so-called Rainbow Nation. I wrote an article many years ago saying it's time to shut down the Rainbow Nation, and that any patriot who has a love for justice and equality would follow my call to do that. Because what we do need to do in South Africa is to replace what we have, the so-called reconciliation, with a complete different national consciousness and infrastructure, one based not on the past, but on a spirit of Black consciousness. I believe that is the only way out of this dreadful chains that white supremacy still impose upon all of us, and whether we're Black or white. So we have this melody of non-racialism. I'm actually doing an event on Saturday speaking about the state of leadership in South Africa, and it happens to fall under one of the departments of South Africa. And I know at that event, we're going to stand up and sing the national anthem, which contains verses of Destem and the old anthem. And I will probably be the only person amongst a panel of Black academics and before a contingent of mostly Black people to sit down for that anthem. Because to me, the fact that we are still singing that anthem is a sign of the prevalence and omnipotence of whiteness in South Africa. And people often ask me if I'm against the whole concept of non-racialism. And I'm not, but I think it obscures the power relations in South Africa. The Black man, Black woman is not equal to the white woman, the Black man, the white man, because the society still favors whiteness. And illustrations of this, well, we have illustrations of this in how the land is still in the hands of white people. We have illustrations of this, how the curriculum is still largely dictated to by white scholarship. We have this in the instance of how white people are still dictating the cultural terms of our broader society. You know, the curriculum thing is a very interesting thing to me, and it shows how old I am. Many of you may not know the late and really great Dr. Agri Cluster, who was very much my mentor. He was the editor-in-chief of Sowetan, and this was during the state of emergency, well before 1994. And he was called the father of nation building, but he was building the nation on the backbone of of Black consciousness rather than white supremacy. And I worked alongside him and the wonderful poet Don Matera, who said that he wrote just with such pain, as if he was writing with the fountainhead of black pain, actually. And he says in his lifetime, and I think he wrote in 1973, about how the Black man's life is worth less than an ounce of gold. He wrote extensively about the exploitation of the mining industry and capitalism and the desperate plight of Black people. And I know when I spoke last week, I spoke about, we have to say, what is the Black man's worth in the current context of South Africa? Because it seems like the currency of whiteness is almost the official currency of South Africa. And the white child, I still believe, is far more powerful. We see that, like, for instance, in the DA, I tried to do an interview on this, and then I was actually shut off most of my appearances I appear for 1 minute and then there seem to be technical problems. But I was speaking about how a character like John Steenhuisen, a very inadequate or mediocre white man, could have risen to the position of president of the opposition party, where he had outstanding black-haired female candidates, doctors, highly qualified, people with a presence on the ground, people with excellent experience and qualifications. But what we see in South Africa is that whiteness always trumps blackness, even when it is the most mediocre. And, it's a sad state. So is the sadness of the fact that as black children who should have been enjoying liberation today on the back of liberation movements such as the NCPAC and others, are still stuck in this paradigm of being a second-rate citizen, as if they are children of a lesser guard. And for the ANC to be leaving that legacy is, to me, beyond comprehension. Going back to Don Matera for a minute, and then I'll wrap up and just ask, and just really would love to welcome some questions. Don Matera wrote very passionately about the Black condition, and his work was not allowed to appear in the school syllabus because the Department of Education, and this is a Department of Education under a so-called Black government, said that his work would be upsetting to a white child and would instill feelings of guilt amongst white children. So the whole syllabus is worked across the lines of white literature, of white history, and that's beyond shocking. I think I always think of the magnificence of Mapungubwe, who was a kingdom, an African kingdom that was hidden for 23 years by the apartheid government, because it dispelled the myth of an empty continent, of a black community that was incapable of trade. And this kingdom was doing strong trade with Asia and other nations across the sea. So I think just just two points to end off. I think what's happened is that white people have become so emboldened by the NC's failure to deal with the scourge pandemic of white supremacy that they feel quite comfortable to spew racism all the time. And I say in my book that white supremacy continues fluently and proudly, as if this is the first language of a post-apartheid South Africa. I also just speak about how the everyday flamboyance of whiteness continues to thrive with the leisurely narcissism on the deep depression of black poverty. The ruling party's meaningless bourgeois tinkering of economic power relations has meant that the logic, patent, and power of colonialism and apartheid continues its supreme rule in a politically free South Africa. Reconciliation, a white man's medicine, as I've said, has harmed rather than healed the nation, even if this was not the attempt. And I speak a lot in my book about the fact that the mantra of the ANC has almost become "do not disturb white supremacy." What I had hoped to achieve in my book is, and this is where I'll finish for this point, is to speak about uncomfortable truths in South Africa. And but I've learned actually through that is that speaking truth often is a blood sport, and it's caused me a lot of damage professionally, personally, on many fronts. I was very fortunate to get Phakamile Hlobo Majola, who's a very, very active activist and the spokesperson of NUMSA, to write the foreword for my book. And she says she thinks that I'll be remembered as a truth teller, and that's hopefully would be the most outstanding legacy I could leave. I think we need, as a nation, a divided nation. I still believe we're in this paradigm that the President Thabo Mbeki spoke about, as two nations, one that lives in prosperity and one that lives in poverty. We have to face the reality of unequal power relationships and fix that very quickly if we are able to give our children and their children a future that is based on the premise of democracy and and justice. And let me conclude with this. I think that unless we address the land issue, and unless we address the issue of language, and unless we deal with the issue of cultural subjugation, we'll never be anywhere. The land has to be taken back. This land in this country has been taken by white people and has to be given back to Black South Africans. My stance on that has been very consistent. The second issue is on language, where we are using colonial languages, both English and Afrikaans, even in our institutions. And I think that is very degrading and disrespectful to Black students and Black academics. And nowhere in the world has a nation succeeded where it's not speaking and putting its original languages forward. Such is China, such is Russia. We will never hear of those presidents speaking in the master's language. And the third is the cultural, and the final thing I'll mention for now is the cultural subjugation, is that the white syllabus, the white way of doing things is put as primary. Black knowledge systems are given very little prestige. There's very little that goes onto the syllabus, and yet there's a dearth of brilliance that exists. And just to conclude this point, I was on a forum where I was speaking to professors, and actually a Black professor wept on this forum and said, I won't say what university he came from. He said, I've been a professor for 10 years, but all my claims, all my admin still has to go through a junior white woman. She controls what I do. She controls what I say, and she controls how I behave in the department. And it was a very painful experience to witness that. Let me end there, and I probably have gone all over the place. I would love to hear questions, criticisms, attacks. I'm used to. Thank you. Let me rest for now.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kim, for sharing your insights and your perspectives about your book, and your thought-provoking, the talk. It sheds light on a lot of important issues in South Africa. We'll take some questions now. If it's okay, can I start off with a question? So I'd like to ask, if we want genuine social transformation in South Africa, what actions do you think or believe are necessary to address these issues and to just rebuild trust in political institutions?
Thank you for that multi-dimension question. I hope I can answer adequately. I think I've spoken about the issue of land and language and culture and reclaiming those, and I think that's critical. I think as far as political organizations are concerned, the electorate has lost a lot of confidence, correctly so, in the ability of the government to change. But I don't think we must judge all governments through the low standards of the ANC. Unfortunately, the ANC has deteriorated from being a party that should have heralded in Black liberation to being a party that can barely provide service delivery. And, the culpability of what we see around us has to be, we have to actually share the responsibility of the failure of the ANC government, because we are consistently, as South African citizens, voting them in. And one has to wonder, do people who are voting the ANC government in think so lowly of themselves and have such low expectations of democracy that year after year we can vote in a party that is brutally mowing down the Black people? My story, just to deviate for a moment, is quite personal. I was very a very devoted ANC member. And my history is that I've come from a very, very conservative white family who really was very against my political activism. So it was a great sacrifice in my own life to become so involved politically, because I tried to, I was always a black sheep in my community and my family. But I was in great support of the ANC. But when I saw the ANC government mowing down its own people, when it had a choice at Marikana, it had a choice to stand against white capital and the interests of the ruling class. And it had a chance to protect its people against such violence, the violence of capitalism, the violence of poverty, the violence of white supremacy. But it chose to stand with the white regime. The white regime being that of business, of media, of vested interests, of imperialist forces that are still present in South Africa, even if they are not as visible as they were before. So in my long answer to that, I'm beginning to sound like an academic now, is that my long answer to that is that we as citizens who believe in democracy and justice, we need to make different electoral decisions. And I'm certainly not speaking here, I'm not involved in any political party, but I would like to urge South Africans to vote for a progressive, Pan-Africanist, Black-orientated party. Until we have a Black consciousness in this country, we can never hope to then land up in a non-racial nation. Black consciousness has to come first. We have to rebuild what the white man and the white system has collapsed so horribly. In terms of gaining trust between white people and Black people, we need to have a reconciliation that's based on real things. It was the great Chris Hani who said, if we want peace, we must fight for social justice. But what has happened? It's been Black people who fought for justice. It's been Black people who've extended their hands with trust and a spirit of Ubuntu towards white people. And white people have not accepted that hand of friendship. They have been obsessed to reconcile with their privilege, while they have seen how Black South Africans have just had to reconcile with poverty. And the ridiculous thing is that white people walk past the most devastating poverty as if it's got nothing to do with them, as if it's like a natural thing. And what worries me is how Black children of the future might eventually see that the poverty, as if poverty for a Black man and a Black woman is a natural thing, rather than the most monstrous man-made phenomenon of apartheid, but something that the ANC government is still cementing in our so-called democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that answer. Any more questions? I'm sure there are more questions. While we wait for more questions, I'll follow up with another question while maybe people think about questions. Kim, the other interesting thing is there is a key focus on land, stolen land, and just white people acknowledging the injustices of apartheid. Like what I guess responses or actions would you hope that the white community will take in order to, address these historical wrongs in South Africa?
Thank you once again for that question. By the way, I'm very open to being challenged on a lot of my views. So if there are people that don't agree with me, I welcome that. And I always believe that we must speak truth. Truth is different to people. So I'm as much as I speak it, if please, I don't mind different opinions. But on to that question, I did raise the issue. I believe that land needs to be returned, but not land. I think the ANC has been very timid in land return. So now they want to look at unused land that is not arable, land that is not being not really suitable. I believe all land should be returned, and I do support the EFF paradigm of all land going to the state and redistributed, because the black people as a whole were deprived of land. And this whole thing of restitution has been so slow because black people have to then prove that land was stolen. And I've been at seminars. In fact, I was at the presidential investigation into land and and the panel that recommended what needed to be done. For some reason, I was involved on that panel at a marginal level, and I saw there was the most heartbreaking session in KwaZulu-Natal with old 90-year-old African women who could barely walk. And they came into the session to explain their stories, the story of how their children were burnt before their eyes, how their fathers died of heart attacks at the brutality of land being stolen. And I looked upon these women and I thought, they will die landless. They will die without land being returned. And land delayed is land denied. The ANC government has had so long to deal with the issue of land justice, and they failed terribly. I know there's some concern that if the state takes back all the land, what will be done? But I think we mustn't place on future governments or potential governments the inability of the ANC to manage that system. I think in theory, there's a lot to be said about the EFF policy on land and certainly the PAC and other progressive organizations. In terms of the inability of white South Africans to confront the great atrocities of the past, it's desperately sad. And when I was at the session last week, but this happens often, a white woman stood up in the audience and said, I should be speaking to white people and trying to shift them. And I'm going to give you the same answer as I gave her, is that there's no ethical framework in the body of most white South Africans. I have gone to the captains of industry. I've sat in their offices and their homes, and I've said, as powerful figures in the white community, start the process of reparations, start the process of giving back land that wasn't yours. And these people have hectares and hectares and hectares of land that they don't use, that they just stare out at, and none of them have been willing to start that debate. I think white people are more in the mode of saying, let's move on, let's put our history behind us, let us get on. And that is, to me, criminal, because they have not accounted for sins committed either by themselves or their forefathers. And, it makes me shameful as a white person that is the lack of morality in white South Africans. And if we were moral human beings, we would have done that years and years ago. We would have actually fallen to our knees and asked for forgiveness from people who still allow us to live in this country, who have never taken vengeance on us. And just perhaps before I end on this question, I'm hardly ever interviewed in South Africa, and I thank you for the opportunity. I'm really blocked and banned from many forums because I speak things that people don't want to hear, but I'm very present on international platforms, and particularly the pro-Palestinian forums. And people consistently say on that platform, but Kim, you're speaking from South Africa, and we see this is a winning democracy, and it's a beautiful democracy, and this is where Palestine needs to go. And I keep saying, no, we are not a democracy. We are not a free nation. The chains may not be so obvious, but they're still there. White supremacy is still in place, and white people have never asked for forgiveness. Our leaders go and kneel down before foreign royalty, so-called royalty, queens and kings, but they've never showed the humility to go and bow down and ask for forgiveness from the Marikana widows. And white people as a whole have never even, they don't even accept culpability. They all say they've worked so hard and they deserve what they get. So there's a complete blanket approach, blanket ignorance, maybe not ignorance, but perhaps white people are just doing what they do best, which is pushing through their own interests, because it's a race that has always put its interests before. there's no, I don't believe on the whole, any will to uplift Black South Africans. The quest for the maintenance of unearned privilege is what the white person holds onto in this country. And it's not just my opinion. I mean, the fact that land is still in the hands of people, or white people, that the JSE, as I said, as curriculum development even, those are symptoms of a untransformed country. It's shameful. My concluding remark on this, and this often gets me into a lot of trouble, is that I think Black people are too conciliatory with white people. They're still hoping that the white woman and the white man will come forward and admit culpability and make things right. But white people are generally not interested. The white system is omnipotent. It's there. It is controlling and snuffing out the fate and fortune of Black children who have got little hope in this democratic nation, in the same way as they had very little hope in the apartheid regime. And it's shameful. What really troubles me at night is that how we as so-called intellectuals and opinion leaders, we allow this to happen, that we are creating this dreadful future for our children, which is as unequal and as violent as it was under apartheid. And while we may not necessarily have the physical violence that we had in apartheid, the violence of a Black child dying out of starvation, the violence of poverty that is endured by most Black people in this country, that's violence. That's real violence. That's sustained violence. It's long-term genocide. And it should really keep us all awake at night. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I see that William had his hand first. Yes, William, you can go ahead and ask him a question or a comment.
Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you for the presentation. And I've got one question, but it has several parts. Just for my own background, you might tell there's an accent. I did not grow up in this country, although I've lived here for about 25 years. I'm now a citizen. I'm a law student at the University of Fort Hare and a frequent correspondent with the Daily Dispatch. I wanted to start by asking you about your presumption that the Europeans took the land from the Africans without any recognition that the Africans took the land from the Khoisan people in a prior, shall we say, invasion of Southern Africa. I'm wondering, where is the concern about the African colonization of the Khoisan society, which basically displaced them from Southeast Africa and pushed them into the Western Cape, only to be later pushed into the Northern Cape after 1652? That leads me on to, obviously, your concern about the national anthem. Why don't we have a Khoisan verse in the South African national anthem? That's almost a flippant question, but it goes to the point of your wanting to be inclusive and diverse in our country. The next point is about the mineral resources in this country. Would things like gold and diamonds have been discovered if whites had not done so? Those minerals were always in the ground and available to the people who were on that ground before they were discovered by the whites in the late 19th century. The next point is, of course, that whilst colonization of Southern Africa and, of course, around the world has proceeded in various stages. We know that England has been invaded probably 10 times in the last 2,000 years. We're now in the situation of having Chinese economic colonization of South Africa. So I suppose my question would be, how do you imagine that South Africa would be like if Europeans had never come here? I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, to me, the land of what we call South Africa, a country that has still to be named, and hopefully under a more progressive government will be named Zani or something more appropriate to reflect the true complexion of the nation and its history will be in place. The issue of the Khoisan is, to me, it's not an argument. It's certainly something I see as null and void. This is Africa. South Africa is an African country, and I think it's, to me, an argument that denialists often use to try and get out of the wholesale redistribution of land to the indigenous people of South Africa, the African people. So I have a very different perspective on that. I don't want to dwell too much on that because it's going to take us into debates on history that I don't believe are helpful. I still stick by my notion that it is the white man and the white colonialists who came in and did the damage. In terms of mineral resources, I'm a bit flabbergasted by the comment, because mineral resources had been mined and were being traded actually across seas by African people well before the white man came in. So the concept of the white man as this great industrialist and discoverer, to me, doesn't make sense to me, because if you look into your history, you'll see what I'm saying is documented. The fact that it doesn't often get into critical library archives is just a symptom of the control that white supremacy yields over all our institutions. But I'm hoping that would come through. So the current colonization of countries such as China and Russia and others, yes, I think there's a scramble for Africa, and South Africa may be caught in that fight. And it raises the question of why leaders are still being able servants of foreign powers to allow extraction rather than protecting and utilizing their natural assets for their own people. And if the white man hadn't come to Africa, I think Africa and South Africa would be a far better place, because there wouldn't have been the complete devastation of resources, the complete brutalization and fracturing of African lives. I think there would be, your argument about people that mineral extraction and mineral wealth was a discovery of whiteness. Well, minerals were always there and were being ably mined by Black people, in the same way that farms were being well and sustainably managed by Black agriculturalists, to the point that they had to be forced into a labor class through taxes and all of this. I mean, the history department, I would imagine, would understand the process of separating the Black man from his land, which was either by force, where women and children were raped, farms were burnt, and people were forced off the land, or they were forced into a laboring class through the imposition of taxes and making it impossible for men to stay and farm. Mostly because these sustainable farmers were actually outperforming many clusters of white and other farmers. That's the version of history I don't believe is told enough in our educational institutions. Thank you.
I'd like to agree with a couple of points. And the first thing about the beneficiation within the country of our mineral resources rather than exporting them, I think we're doing ourselves a big disservice by not being properly or fully industrialized so that we can export value-added products rather than raw materials. The other thing too is about farms. In the Transkei, the land was well managed and farmed prior to 1994, and the closer people living there were doing an excellent job of farming the land for themselves. Unfortunately, it's fallen into disuse at the moment since 1994. So there's a number of points you're making that I can agree with. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much. Dr. Deza has a question for us. Please, Doc.
No, thank you kindly for the opportunity. Revolutionary greetings to you, Kim, and everyone who's on Spaces and equally on this particular platform. Perhaps, Kim, I want to poke your mind on the one of the most important sectors of the society, which is the ownership of the means of production. You know, as you might be aware, I'm a member of the Economic Freedom Fighters, and the EFF speaks of the means of production in terms of the nationalization of the mines and the banks and all other strategic sectors of the economy. Now, my question to you is on the nationalization of the Central Bank of South Africa, which is our Reserve Bank. You would recall that the People's Public Protector Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane made a recommendation for the amendment of the mandate of the Reserve Bank of South Africa that it must be able to intervene where students are not funded, where poverty levels are rising, where fuel prices are equally rising, that a central bank, a state central bank, should be able to then intervene. We know that the Reserve Bank of South Africa is privately owned. So I want to check with you, what's your view on the ownership of the Reserve Bank, the nationalization of the Reserve Bank, the economy of South Africa still reflecting colonial representation? What's your view, and what could be the most cogent way of ensuring that the state bank returns back to the people? Thank you very much, Kim.
Thank you. I think that is a very central question and something I should have addressed in my opening speech and address. You know, the issue of the means of production, you know, is absolutely critical and remains completely in the hands of whiteness. So if we look at, let me just answer your question in a broad sense. If we look at across society, we see that every institution, I believe, is still white controlled, whether this is overt or covert. So I once again bring in the universities, and I'd love to have objections to what I'm saying and counter arguments, and the media, and certainly the banks. And I did one of the people on at the forum that I was speaking at UNISA was speaking about banks as a fortress of the rich and the guillotine of the poor. And I think he was speaking about how Black people are prejudiced in the banking situation, just even in their normal transactions. And this is not just a by the way comment, this is a fact. We've seen banks having to return ridiculous interest rates because of racial prejudice to many Black South Africans who are seen as a risk just by virtue of being Black as opposed to being credit risks. So the whole banking structure, I think, is very prejudiced and keeps the Black child as a second-rate citizen. As far as the Reserve Bank is concerned, I think there's a desperate need to review the mandate of that bank. And, you know, so in so many countries, including the US and in very strong developing economies, there's been a lot of debate about the role of the central bank, the Reserve Bank, as a bank that doesn't only look after the currency, but takes responsibility to make sure that its people are sufficiently economically able and to survive and to be empowered to deal with issues of unemployment. And when we look at South Africa, where I think we're actually the highest level of unemployment in the world right now. I was seeing some statistics recently, and certainly the most unequal. But we now have pride of place amongst the countries that have the worst instances of unemployment. And when we look at restructuring of the Reserve Bank, it should be broadened to caretake the people of South Africa as alongside and twinned with its mandate of looking after currency matters. And we've had attempts to do this. I mean, the public protector, the previous public protector, had pushed this agenda. And what we saw, rather than her socially responsible and developmentally orientated recommendation being embraced by society in a responsible manner. She was, the guillotine fell upon her, and in fact, it probably was the beginning and end of her unfair, to me, what I believe illegal outing by people who didn't want her to touch the very levers of white control. So, in a long answer to you, Dr. Deza, I would say that almost needs to be second to the question of land, a great debate for hopefully a new government to discuss post the May 29th election. I think the ANC is very timid and terrified of white interests. It's beholden to that. So as long as the ANC government is in play, we will never have those kind of debates. Once again, I think because the ANC has so desperately mismanaged the economy and most of its assets, I think the people of South Africa are wary of the means of production being given to the state. But I do believe under a responsible government, it is the only way to ensure that the economic wealth, which is vast in South Africa, is shared equally amongst its people. Or now I'm beginning to sound like the Freedom Charter, but shared across people, and certainly Black South Africans who have been completely dislodged and marginalized from society. And just a shout out to you, Dr. Deza, and your team, who I see are broadcasting this live. And I would just like to say the role that you played in empowering and enlightening the youth of this country, I think is phenomenal, and it's lovely to see you on this platform. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Kim. Host, if you don't mind, I do have a follow-up.
That's perfectly fine.
No, thank you kindly. Kim, I want you to equally, and thank you for that. Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane had brought us to this conversation of the central bank, and we've seen what white power has been able to do to her in that regard. But since we are equally in an academic platform, perhaps we must speak to the issue of language. We have seen how two colonial languages, which has been Afrikaans and English, has actually taken over our society. I am an alumni of Northwest University, which is one of the most racist university here in South Africa, whereby there is a rule actually when you go to the Potchefstroom campus of the Northwest University, where they only allow 10% of Black students. So the university is serving as a colonial haven for apartheid beneficiaries and the descendants to then have something they can refer to as their home. What do you make of the development of a native language, and that it must equally become the language of instructions in university? And what do you have to say also that 30 years later into this so-called freedom, which we have termed the negotiated settlement, what do you say to the issue of language? Because I believe that a person or a people or a nation cannot be able to exist without its own language, as that becomes its heritage, but also an identity. So what do you make of the South African current status quo and the development of language, particularly within institution? Lastly, also to emphasize this particular point, Dr. Pedro Mzileni writes a beautiful paper on how Nelson Mandela and him being brought up as a Umxhosa and being taught leadership within the Xhosa tradition influenced his leadership in South Africa. For those who might not be familiar with Dr. Pedro, he is a scholar, and he was with the University of the Free State. He's now with the University of KZN. He's one of the brilliant scholars of sociology, but also decolonized education. Thank you very much, Kim. I would like to hear your views on that.
Thank you. I mean, that's a very central question. I did raise it a little bit earlier, and I'd just like to have the privilege of answering that in quite it's part of some other thoughts. Language is critical, and I would think I was saying at that UNISA presentation, just by the way, the UNISA, there's a very interesting potential new unit, which is looking at the heritage of slavery and colonialism. And I get very excited when I see these things developing, because the heritage and the way we tell history in this country is so warped, in my view. And I would love to, hopefully I'll be allowed to visit Fort Hare and look at your history department and see the wonderful work that you're doing, because I do hear very good and progressive things about the work that is being done. But what we've generally done, just before I go to Dr. Des's point, is that we've actually downgraded the history of the African people in this country, and using a word of Cyril Ramaphosa, supersized that of whiteness. I mean, it's very much to the point that I probably responded to quite arrogantly by to one of the previous speakers, William, by saying that the history of the white man has been, we mustn't look at him as a discoverer or the creator of wealth. In fact, he's just been largely the great exploiter. But the stories of whiteness and great white people prevails when we've lost the cultural and linguistic history, which is deep and rich and filled with wisdom amongst African people, because it's been deliberately and systemically wiped out. And just before I get to his point, I referred at that discussion that I was speaking at about last year. I was appointed, actually, surprisingly, because I don't think the NC likes me very much, as part of the Heritage Committee for the Arts and Culture Department. And what we did was we went and we surveyed the heritage landscape, and we looked at declaring new heritage sites. Most of the heritage sites were based on apartheid heroes. I mean, we still have F.W. de Klerk's statue all over the place. And I was amongst a group of people who were saying those statues must be declared as monstrosities, as statues of disgrace. And what we did with some very progressive people is we managed to try and reshape the heritage landscape by declaring some very interesting sites of Black consciousness and PAC leaders who'd been horribly forgotten. And there's a reason I'm mentioning it, because when we look to the left of the ANC, we see political parties of the liberation days trying to push cultural identity, trying to push questions of language. If they had come into power, they would never have been so accommodating of white languages, of white power systems, of white ways of teaching. And it's by no accident that the West supported the ANC government, because everything was preserved, including language. And Amathole, as a teacher throughout his life, a dedicated teacher, has seen the impact that teaching in another language causes in the cognitive development and intellectual development of a young Black child. And I think it's an educationally criminal offense, actually, that we are allowing that in a country that is in Africa to speak and give pride of place to the languages of the colonial master, and where white people, including of myself, can barely speak African language, and that we we know that we can get away with that, because such is the power that we are accorded, even in a free South Africa, that we get away with that. And strange enough, when a white person can speak a few bars of Zulu, people applaud that, as if this is something that should be commended. At the same time, we have Black people who are mocking other Black people for speaking English in an inadequate way or missing out a word. And that creates great excitement amongst what I would call the clever Blacks. It's very, it's very depressing to see how there's been a debasing of Black people by Black people. And, you know, actually before this seminar concludes, I would also like to speak, not now, but perhaps as I close, on the culpability of Black people in almost suspending and enforcing and their own oppression. Because what we're seeing is that by the adoption of English languages, Afrikaans languages, the colonial languages and ways of doing it, many Black people, scholars, and across all ambits of society are actually becoming the cheerleaders of white supremacy. And before I forget it, because I'm old, there's a beautiful quote and it's a very, very, very good book by Dr. Tom Burrow. He's an African American, and he writes a book about deconstructing the myth of Black inferiority. And he speaks about how white supremacy has been a 400, 500 year long campaign of like a marketing campaign to spew this white dogma of white superiority. But what he's saying is that it's so powerful that what he's seeing today in America, and I think his statement applies across the world, is that it is the Black person who has eagerly taken up the baton in this race to finish off the race and actually completes the race on behalf of the white master. And that's a very devastating phenomenon that we're seeing, how Black people are actually almost becoming the servants and of white supremacy by just perpetuating it through their behavior. And I think that we don't like to speak about that often. I'm also aware as a white person, it's a very sensitive subject to deal with, but I always speak about it from the point of view is that for those Black people who are consistently seeking white affirmation, which is also a deeply and permanent symptom of being under the system of white oppression. White people will never affirm Black people. You can have 25 qualifications, you can have 300 degrees, but in the eyes of most white people, you will always be inferior. And that's very sad, because what we see while Black people mock Black people for not speaking English correctly, they are uplifting the desperate narrative of the white man, actually, and destroying love between Africans. And I think one of the sad phenomenons of today's so-called ANC democracy is that Black people have become more interested in trying to reach out for white affirmation, which is unrequited. They'll never get it. And by doing so, making love for Black people and unity amongst Black people less important. It makes me sad. Obviously, a lot of these things make me sad, but I do try and point out things that are really deflating true liberation and equality in this nation of ours.
Thank you, Kim. Do we have any more questions? Our guests and colleagues, are there any more questions? Yes, Dr. Deza.
No, thank you kindly. Thank you, Ngebokazi, for hosting us, but also Kim, thank you for that particular submission. There's a very interesting chapter in your book, Kim, that speaks to Shut the Rainbow Nation Now. And I would like you to expand on this particular submission as to why do you feel strongly that it's important that the Rainbow Nation should therefore be shut now? I feel that it's one of the most important chapter in No White Lies. Could you just enlighten us as to what inspired this particular notion, given the current contemporary status quo, socio-economic status quo of South Africa? But also, in addition to that, I want you to perhaps speak a little bit on the unity of the African continent. We have faced some concocted a backlash in terms of our Pan-African stance and progressive internationalism. If you can just touch on those, it will be appreciated. Ngabakasi, thank you equally for allowing us and indulging us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Those are very interesting questions. In terms of the Rainbow Nation, let me just perhaps summarize and take the opportunity also to just speak about what motivated me. I was very motivated by trying to tell the truth about the state of our democracy, because the very notion of reconciliation never really happened. And I speak in that chapter, or perhaps earlier in my book, about the fact that the reconciliation, it was actually an arranged marriage consummated on the bloodstained sheets of violence and subjugation and terror under apartheid. So you can't have an arranged marriage. You can't have a relationship built on such an unequal relationship where Black people had been in a storm of injustice and violence for so many years, but then they were expected to get into bed with their white fellow South Africans and make love, actually, to put it quite simply, because they were actually asked to discard the deep injustices that they had to bear, as if these were like the forgotten offspring of perhaps an illicit relationship. That's how I would put it, carrying on this theme of what actually was consummated on the eve of our so-called reconciliation. There was no reconciliation. There was a continuation of the white tender of privilege. There was a continuation of economic contracts that white people were just entitled to continue without any glare. And in this context, let me speak about the Eskom type situation, or the SOE type situation, where so few questions have been asked about the power of whiteness in those SOEs. For instance, on procurement, there was much ado about the Gupta involvement, but it was less than 9% or even 4%. 90% of procurement at SOEs is in the hands of white people in these evergreen, whatever they call, contracts. But no one has bothered to look at that phenomenon and how white control still remains through those kind of evergreen situations, which the ANC has actually allowed and accommodated. So, these big question, and I often say that it's almost as if, and white people, Black people will fight about that 4% that went to the Guptas and then they become the most dreadful people on earth. Certainly there may be dreadful people, but the people who have actually strangled the economy of South Africa and kept it all to themselves, while Black mothers are languishing and unable to feed their children, not because of their own incapacity, but because of a system that doesn't look after them. We see Black people seem to be quite comfortable with a small part of the pie. So they fight on that 5%, 6%, whatever. But what about the 90% that is in the hands of white people? And it's the same thing, and I've tried to be very critical of the university sector, hoping to get some response from people who may challenge me. But even if we look at the university situation, what I find quite strange is that even our studies of how we study history and how we study African wisdom and knowledge, it's almost like the universities have a ghetto of African studies, or a small little department allocated to that, rather than the whole university being a bastion of Blackness. Not to exclude white people. White people can be there as long as they understand that this is a Black country, the African country, that the curriculum must be African, and that all systems and ways of doing things in society must be African orientated. then white people can be part of that. But the fact that most departments in universities and schools are so Eurocentric, where Black scholars are not given pride of place. They're still in the margins. And when they do write, they probably write for Western journals rather than to develop a homegrown body of literature. You know, that's my perception. But so I think to answer Dr. Des's question is that I think I was tired of the lies of what we're living, and I didn't want to be part of that. I didn't want to leave a soccer match. Not that many white people would go to Kaizer Chiefs matches, and I've never been to a rugby match, but I wouldn't want to participate in these glorious exhibitions of what we call togetherness, which is such nonsense, because Black people will go back to the most horrendous living conditions, while white people will easily walk back to their Houghton mansions and forget completely about the so-called togetherness. So I think it's time, well, I wrote in my book that it's time that we stopped living a lie and pretending that we're a reconciled nation and facing the truth. And until we answer the hard questions of shutting down what we have, which is an apartheid versioned society. And a book that might be really worth reading is Dr. Sizwe Mpofo Walsh's book. He writes about how the new apartheid, how the new nation that we speak about is just a different version, a privatized apartheid. So I feel very strongly that it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we have a different future for our children. We have to break down systems of white control, of colonial hegemony, and make sure that we bring about a new consciousness and new systems where the African child, first and foremost, can feel comfortable and can grow, not in a way dictated to by a white man's agenda or curriculum, but on terms that are his or her own. And I think that after the troubled history that this country has had, we owe that at least to future generations. And I wonder sometimes if I will ever see economic liberation in my lifetime. I doubt it. Well, I hope so. But I think we have to, as responsible and patriotic people, start telling the truth about this country. White people in particular need to embrace the truth about this country and make reparations today. This is absolutely imperative if we are ever to call ourselves a true nation. And at this stage, we are very far from that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. I see that William has a question. Yes, William?
Thank you very much for a second bite. Your discussion has been very interesting, Kim. I appreciate that. Just to assure you about my attendance at university, I'm in a class of about 500 students. I think I'm the only Mlungu. And the faculty does have its own internal peer-reviewed journal. So I think we're doing some of the things that you'd like us to do. I got two things. I noticed your concern about the president and his cohort visiting European capitals, kings and queens and the like. And in particular, its association with the World Economic Forum, as well as with Russia. It's supping with devils in both issues, in my opinion. I just wanted to hear what you thought about its association with the World Economic Forum, and particularly the fact that it was involved, I don't want to say duped into the mass inoculation under COVID-19, which has turned out to be perhaps not the best thing that should have happened in the world. The other question I wanted to is pick up on something you did mention in passing, Black consciousness. I'm almost Steve Biko's twin. He was born 13 days before me. I know his widow, and I know other people of his family. I've visited there. So I wanted to hear your views on what you think the role of Black consciousness would be in the upliftment, emancipation, whatever you want to call it, of South Africa. In other words, the improvement in its way forward. Thank you.
Thank you for a set of great questions, and it just makes me think that I didn't answer Dr. Des's question earlier properly about Black unity, so I should also probably across the African continent, and let me bring that answer in. You know, the World Economic Forum, I think that there's been I think that's just a mother body of imperialist interests that don't serve South Africa. Even most of these the involvement of African leaders on these bodies is not serving the continent at all well. And to try and merge my answer on those two questions, I think that Africa has been quite poor at establishing its own effective bodies economically to address its very own questions. So we have the AU, but mostly being quite ineffective. We're seeing that this continent is so wealthy, but that most of the beneficiation occurs to build foreign nations rather than our very own. And I write quite extensively about Africa, and just it's almost every country is just in the most desperately poor situation. A lot of it fueled by countries countries and companies, multinationals that are trying to just continue to extract. So I think it's incumbent upon Africans to look at, and African leaders to look at different vehicles that might be more suitable and beneficial to the people of Africa. But sadly, we have a group of African leaders that have shown very little interest in their own people, and will rush off to Europe at any invitation, even if it's scanty and it involves being moved around in buses while white leaders are treated to chauffeurs and much better conditions. And I think that's the state of a lack of confidence amongst leaders to run their own economies. African unity is absolutely paramount. And I know I began my talk by saying I'm a foreign illegal and settler in this country. And what I think has been very devastating is to see how Africans in South Africa have treated fellow brothers and sisters and talked about them as foreigners. Sadly, because people don't understand the true diagnosis of this country in terms of that wealth has been plundered by white, big, large capital companies, and that's effectively why African people are poor, because people don't understand that fully, and because propaganda doesn't steer itself in that direction. There's been very much aggression against fellow brothers and sisters, and I find that that's devastating, because even if all of those people had to go to their countries, there would be very little change in the economic fortunes of Black people in South Africa. It's until we change that white system that economic fortunes and fates will remain destitute and desperate. I think what we're seeing is quite an interesting reconfiguration of geopolitical relations and powers. I think BRICS may not be a force now, but I think increasingly in about a decade, I think it's going to start to show its teeth, and hopefully will certainly, I think with Iran coming on board and some quite big powers, I think it could start dictating terms and shaping the world economy far more than it is today. When I look at some of the younger and more progressive leaders in Africa, in Burkina Faso, Niger, and the like, we're seeing a different approach to dealing with world bodies, economic forums, and also young leaders who are speaking about the absurdity of African countries paying colonial taxes. I don't know how that is possible, that these desperately poor nations are still paying back to the colonial master. It's just absurd. I think the issue of Black consciousness is very important, and I think the work of Steve Biko is more important today than it ever was, even in his day. Interestingly enough, going back to my pet subject of the very biased curricula syllabus, is that Steve Biko's works are not allowed in our schools. I actually know, I'm quite friendly with a publisher who does books on Steve Biko's works and other leaders, but they won't. And schools have those in their libraries, but they're not part of the syllabus. I don't know what the university libraries are like. In my experience, and those I've seen recently, they're still filled with the body of work of white writers largely. Sometimes there's one or two black names that come in as researchers, but it's not the norm. And I think that's very indicative of a society and an intellectual framework that is not governing itself. The issue of black consciousness is critical. You know, Steve Biko was not killed by accident because his philosophy was the antidote to white supremacy. If that had been applied in our society, we wouldn't be having the issues we have now. And just to finish off your question on a personal note, I always like to bring in my personal experiences. I was asked I think it was 2022, to engage in it was a very prestigious school, and they were having so-called problems with racism because the white kids in matric were not understanding some of the concerns of black students, and the syllabus was very white, and actually the young black students stood up for that, the one being a granddaughter of a great PAC leader, and they were challenging the syllabus because it was shocking how white orientated it was. But also white kids were making the situation so white orientated that the black girls felt very uncomfortable, to the point that one was on the verge of suicide, where the teachers were backing the white students, and the white student philosophy and the philosophy of the school was to say that apartheid has left. Let's move on as equal people. So I did a bit of trauma counseling with the school, but mostly said to the teachers that the situation was unacceptable, and the issue of black girls feeling uncomfortable in this day and age in a mixed school was just was really criminal. And my discussion with the black girls, I said to them, they have everything that they need within them. They just need black confidence, but the world is telling them that they are not enough. And why I mentioned the story, it was very emotional, because I saw outstanding young women who could become leaders in our society. They were very profound in what they were saying, but they were still in matric level. They were still being swamped and snuffed out by a system that was predominantly white. And yet everything that they need is inside themselves. So until the black child learns the confidence that was so taken out of him, if we look at the work of Steve Biko, who spoke about a empty shell of a man, that tells us very much that that white supremacy emptied the black man of all, and the black woman, Biko mentioned in that way, of all he had, and robbed him of so much. But what's happened in the new society is that hole, that shell, has been filled up with whiteness rather than an authentic blackness. And that is why black supremacy is the tonic that is needed right now. And it gives me much hope when I look at some of the young university students and some of the political parties, where young black people are saying enough is enough. They're not taking the dreadful abuse that older generations of black people and scholars have had to been subjected to. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? If we don't have any more questions, I can close up for us. Okay. I don't think there are any more questions. Thank you so much, Kim. The evident disparities, that exist between black and white people in this country, they are heartbreaking, and we literally see them everywhere. And this book, it challenges all of us. It challenges, the prevailing racist narratives that exist within this country. Our country is quite deeply wounded. So thank you for having the courage to speak, truth to power. I know that can be quite an awfully marginalizing thing. And just thank you for confronting, these difficult truths. This is an invaluable contribution to this ongoing conversation in South Africa. And yes, one of these days we would love to have you at the history department. We will extend an invitation. In the future, we do plan on having these talks in person. Thank you. Thank you for everyone who took the time out of their busy schedules to, share and participate in this discussion. And thank you guys for all your insightful questions and the contributions and the comments. It was incredibly inspiring. Thank you very much.